The groom refused to marry the obese black lady, but the Korean Mafia boss walked in and said, "I will." That was the moment Kendra Lewis realized her life was actually a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. She stood at the front of the Grace Community Chapel, feeling the sweat soak into the lace of her $3,000 gown. For 6 months, she had worked herself to the bone to pay for this day. She had used every cent of her savings to give David Reynolds the corporate wedding of his dreams. David was a man on the rise, a polished executive who always talked about his brand and his future. Kendra had spent years supporting him, doing his reports, managing his schedule, and loving him when he had nothing. She thought today was her reward. If the way David is about to treat Kendra makes you want to scream, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to our channel and drop your location and the current time in the comments. You need to stay until the end, because the man who is about to walk through those doors is going to teach David a lesson he will never forget. David didn't take her hands when the music stopped. Instead, he took a step back, his face twisting into a look of pure disgust. The microphone clipped to his expensive suit carried his voice to every single person in the room. He told her he couldn't do it. He told Kendra that he had an image to maintain and that he couldn't have a wife who looked like her. He called her embarrassing. He said he deserved someone who actually fit the lifestyle of a top executive. The gasps from the pews felt like physical blows. Kendra's mother started to cry, and David's sisters, who Kendra had treated like her own blood, were snickering behind their silk bouquets. Kendra felt like the floor was going to swallow her whole. She had been the invisible girl her whole life because of her size, but today, she was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. She had given David everything. She had been his rock, his brain, and his biggest supporter. And now, he was throwing her away in front of her family and friends because he was ashamed of her body. David turned his back on her, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor as he started to walk down the aisle. He was leaving her there, a mountain of white silk and broken dreams, while the people she knew whispered about her weight. But David didn't make it to the exit. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chapel didn't just open. They were slammed wide with a force that made the windows shake. A man stepped into the light. He wasn't a wedding guest. He wore a sharp, charcoal black suit that cost more than David's entire career. As he walked toward the altar, the light caught the dark ink of a tattoo crawling up his neck. This was Seo Kong-woo. He was a man people only spoke about in hushed tones in the financial districts. They called him the Ghost of Seoul. He was the head of a massive syndicate that controlled half the city, and he was the last person anyone expected to see in a church. Kong-woo didn't even look at David as he passed him. David actually scurried to the side of the aisle to get out of the way, looking like a scared child. Kong-woo walked straight up to the altar and stood in front of Kendra. He didn't look at the priest or the shocked crowd. He reached out and used his thumb to wipe a single tear from Kendra's cheek. His touch was light, but his eyes were like cold stone. He turned to the priest, his voice a deep baritone that commanded the entire room into total submission. He said that if the fool didn't want a diamond, then he would take her. He told the whole church that he would marry her right now. The room exploded in confusion, but Kong-woo didn't blink. He grabbed Kendra's hand, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was standing next to a king. Seo Kong-woo didn't wait for a response from the priest, who looked like he was about to faint. The air in the chapel had changed from the scent of lilies to the heavy, electric feeling of power. Every person in those pews was holding their breath. Kendra looked up at the man standing beside her. She knew him, but only from a distance. As a forensic accountant, she had spent weeks digging through the complex financial records of one of his companies. They had met only once, in a cold, glass-walled office where he had watched her work with an intensity that made her heart race. She thought he was just another client. She never thought he was watching her for a reason. Kendra whispered to him, her voice shaking so hard she could barely get the words out. She asked him what he was doing and told him he didn't even know her. But Kong-woo leaned in close, so close she could smell his expensive cologne and the faint scent of something metallic. He told her that he knew her better than the coward David ever did. He called her the most brilliant woman in the city. He told her he knew she had found the hidden leaks in the Hangul accounts, and that she was the only one brave enough to fix them. He said she was a queen trapped in a world of small-minded people who weren't fit to breathe her air. He squeezed her hand, and his grip felt like iron. It wasn't a request, it was a claim. Down the aisle, David Reynolds had regained some of his courage, which was his first mistake. He started shouting, asking who Kong Wu thought he was, and telling him to get away from his wedding. But Kong Wu didn't even turn around. He just made a small gesture with his hand. Two massive men in suits stepped forward from the back of the room. They didn't hit David, they just stood in his way, their faces like masks. David turned pale. He realized he wasn't dealing with a corporate rival. He was dealing with a man who could make him disappear before the sun went down. The guests who had been laughing at Kendra moments ago were now looking at their laps, terrified that Kong Wu might notice them next. Kong Wu led Kendra off the altar. He didn't stay for the ceremony because he didn't need a priest to tell him what belonged to him. As they walked down the aisle, the same people who had snickered at Kendra's size were now bowing their heads as she passed. She felt the weight of her gown change. It no longer felt like a symbol of her failure. It felt like a robe of power. Kong Wu led her out the front doors to a fleet of black SUVs that were idling at the curb. His men held the doors open like she was royalty. As the door clicked shut, cutting off the sound of the church, Kendra finally felt like she could breathe. Inside the darkened interior of the vehicle, Kong Wu handed her a silk handkerchief. He didn't say anything at first. He just let her sit in the silence of her new reality. Kendra asked him why he would do this. She was a forensic accountant, someone who lived in the world of facts, and none of this made sense. Kong Wu looked out the window at the passing city, his jaw tight. He told her it was because she had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. He said he needed someone like her by his side, but not as an employee. He said he wanted her as his wife and his queen. He said he had been waiting for the right moment to take her away from a man who didn't deserve to touch her shoes. Then he told her the truth about David that she hadn't even found yet. He told her that David hadn't just humiliated her. He told her that David had drained their joint account that morning to pay for a penthouse for his new girlfriend. He knew about the debt David was trying to pin on Kendra's name. Kendra felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't even checked her bank alerts. David had used her for years, and now he was trying to ruin her financially as a final goodbye. Kong Wu reached over and touched her chin, forcing her to look into his dark eyes. He promised her that by the time he was done, David would wish he had never been born. The SUV pulled into the gates of a massive estate on the outskirts of the city. It was a place of high walls and armed guards, a fortress built for a man who lived in the shadows. Kong Wu told her that this was her home now. He said that in his world, people would fear her because she belonged to him. He told her that the world was done laughing at her. He said that from this day forward, she would be the one who decided who lived and who lost everything. Kendra looked at the black diamond ring he pulled from his pocket, and she realized the forensic accountant she used to be was gone. She was now the woman of the ghost of soul, and the revenge was only just beginning. Kendra's fingers were trembling as she pulled her phone out of the hidden pocket of her wedding dress. The screen felt cold, almost as cold as the reality she was currently living. She opened her banking app, praying that Kong Wu was wrong, that David wouldn't be that cruel. But as the page loaded, her heart stopped. 0. The joint account she had spent 5 years growing, the money she had saved from every overtime shift and every forensic audit, was gone. David had left her with nothing but a wedding dress she couldn't afford and a mountain of debt. She felt the tears starting to burn again, but she refused to let them fall in front of this stranger. David had told her she was a background character, and now he had written her out of her own life. Kong Wu didn't reach for her hand this time. He just sat there, his profile sharp against the passing streetlights. He told her that crying was a waste of energy. He said that David Reynolds was a small man who thought stealing from a woman was the same thing as being powerful. Kong Wu's voice was steady, almost like he was talking about the weather, but there was a hidden edge to it that made Kendra shiver. He told her that David hadn't just taken her money. He had taken it to impress a woman who would leave him the second his luck ran out. Kendra looked at the dark, tinted windows. She thought about her mother, her bills, and the humiliation she had just survived. She felt small, but for the first time, she also felt a spark of something else. Rage. As the SUVs moved through the city, the scenery changed. They weren't in the corporate district anymore. They were heading toward the hills, toward the kind of estates that people like Kendra only saw in movies. The gates they passed through were reinforced steel, guarded by men who didn't look like security guards. They looked like soldiers. Kong Wu told her that from this moment on, her old life was dead. He said the girl who let people walk over her had stayed at that church. He told her she was now part of a world where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Kendra looked at the black diamond ring on her finger. It felt heavy, a constant reminder that she had traded her freedom for protection. They pulled up to a massive glass and stone structure that overlooked the entire city. Kong Wu got out and held the door for her himself. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered. He told her that her mother had already been moved to a safe location and that her bills had been settled. Kendra was stunned. She asked him how he had done all of this so fast. He simply replied that power doesn't wait for permission. As she stepped into the grand foyer, the marble floors reflecting the moonlight, she realized she wasn't a forensic accountant anymore. She was a woman standing on the edge of a new, dangerous beginning. Kong Wu stood at the bottom of the stairs, his shadow long and imposing. He told her that he didn't want her to be a victim in his story. He said he brought her here because she was the only one who could help him fix a problem that was worth millions. But more than that, he said he brought her here because he wanted to see what happened when a woman with her mind finally realized she was a goddess. Kendra looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that for all the danger he represented, he was the first person to ever see her as a prize. She took a deep breath, clutching the silk of her gown, and followed him into the dark. He was her shield now, and she was his anchor. The game had just begun for them both. David had no idea what was coming. Kendra was ready to take everything back from the world. Kendra stood in the middle of the master suite, and for a moment, she couldn't move. The penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and steel, with views of the city that made the world look like a toy box. But it wasn't the view that took her breath away. It was the closet. Kong Wu had told her he replaced her wardrobe, but she hadn't expected this. There were rows of silks, wools, and leathers, all tailored perfectly for a woman with her curves. These weren't the clothes she usually wore, the loose, dark outfits meant to make her disappear into the background. These were bold colors, deep emeralds, rich burgundies, and midnight blues. They were designed to be seen. She touched the sleeve of a silk dress, the fabric feeling like water against her skin. For years, David had told her she should wear black to look smaller. He made her feel like her body was a problem that needed to be hidden. But as she looked at these clothes, she realized they were made to celebrate her. There were no plus-size labels here. There was only luxury. She realized then that Kong Wu hadn't just bought her clothes. He had bought her a new way of seeing herself. She pulled on a deep red gown that draped over her hips, the fabric hugging her in all the right places. For the first time in her life, she didn't look in the mirror and see a fat girl. She saw a powerful woman. The door to the suite opened, and Kong Wu stepped inside. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing the intricate tattoos that covered his forearms. He stopped when he saw her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his gaze traveling slowly from her head to her toes. It wasn't the way men usually looked at her, with either judgment or hidden laughter. It was a look of pure, unadulterated appreciation. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped just inches away, and the heat radiating from him made Kendra's skin tingle. He reached out and traced the line of her shoulder, his thumb brushing against the silk. He told her that she had spent too long listening to people who were blind. He said that in his culture, a woman with her presence was seen as a sign of wealth and health. He told her that David was a fool who wanted a trophy he could control, but he wanted a woman who could stand beside him. He said she was magnificent. Kendra felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was the slow burn of being truly seen by a man who didn't care about social rules or corporate images. Kong Wu told her that tonight they would begin their work. He said the men who were stealing from him thought they were smart, but they hadn't met her yet. He promised that while she worked to find his money, he would work to make her feel like the queen she was. He told her that he didn't want her to hide anymore. He wanted her to walk through his world with her head held high, knowing that anyone who dared to look at her with anything but respect would have to answer to him. Kendra looked at her reflection in the glass, the city lights shimmering behind her. She realized she wasn't just safe, she was empowered. She was no longer running from her past. She was stepping into a future where she was the most dangerous woman in the room. She was his queen now, and nothing could stop them. He smiled for the first time, and the world outside seemed to wait for her command. David was nothing but a ghost now. Kendra was finally, truly, absolutely free. Numbers have a funny way of telling the truth when everyone else is lying. For Kendra, sitting in a high-tech office surrounded by monitors felt more natural than standing at an altar. David had always mocked her job, calling it boring and saying she was just a glorified bookkeeper. But as she sat in the silent, glass-walled room at the CO estate, she knew she was the most powerful person in the building. Kong Wu had handed her the encrypted ledgers of his legitimate shipping companies, and within 2 hours, Kendra had found what his best security teams had missed. This wasn't just a small accounting error. This was a massive, deliberate theft. Someone deep inside his organization was moving millions of dollars into accounts linked to the Hangul syndicate. She leaned back in the ergonomic chair, her eyes tired but her mind racing. David Reynolds had stolen her savings to buy a girl a penthouse, but these people were stealing an entire empire to fund a war. The scale of the betrayal made her stomach turn. She wasn't just looking at spreadsheets. She was looking at a map of a planned execution. If this money kept moving, Kong Wu's legitimate businesses would collapse, leaving him vulnerable to his rivals. She realized then why he had been so focused on her during their one brief meeting months ago. He didn't just want a wife. He needed a genius who could see the invisible threads of a conspiracy. When the door opened, she didn't jump. She felt the change in the air before she heard his footsteps. Kong Wu walked in, carrying 2 cups of steaming black coffee. He set one down in front of her, his hand lingering near hers for just a second. He asked her what she had found. Kendra didn't use big words or try to impress him. She just pointed at the screen and showed him the pattern. She explained how the money was being diverted through a series of shell companies in Panama and then cycled back into local accounts. She showed him that the person doing it was likely his own chief financial officer. Kong Wu stood behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. The weight of his touch was grounding. He didn't look at the screen with anger. He looked at it with a cold, terrifying focus. He told her that he had suspected a leak for a long time, but no one could prove it. He said his men were good at violence, but they were blind to the quiet movements of money. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, and told her that she had just saved more lives than she could imagine. Kendra felt a rush of pride that she hadn't felt in years. With David, she was always too much or not enough. With Kong Wu, she was the key to his survival. He told her that he had been right about her. He said she was a titan disguised as a girl who thought she was invisible. Kendra looked up at him, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide her face or pull her shoulders in. She felt like she belonged in this high-stakes world of shadows and secrets. But the discovery came with a price. Now that she knew the truth, she was the primary target for the people who were stealing the money. Kong Wu promised her that his men would never leave her side, but Kendra knew that the game had shifted. She wasn't just a rescued bride anymore. She was a major player in a Mafia war that was about to get very loud. If you can't believe the level of betrayal Kendra just uncovered, you need to hit that subscribe button right now. We are just getting started, and you don't want to miss the moment Kong Wu finds out who the traitor really is. Drop a comment with your city and the time you're listening. Do you think Kendra is safe now, or did she just put a target on her back? Stay tuned, because the next chapter changes everything. The library at the CO estate was a place where the air felt old and heavy, filled with the scent of leather books and expensive cigars. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but Kendra couldn't sleep. The data she had uncovered earlier was still screaming in her head. She sat in a massive velvet armchair, wrapped in a silk robe that cost more than her car. The silence of the house was absolute, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a predator waiting in the grass. She jumped when she saw a shadow move near the fireplace. Kong Wu was sitting there in the dark, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't apologize for startling her. He just watched her with those dark, unblinking eyes. He told her that he had spent most of his life watching people, trying to figure out their weaknesses so he could use them. He said that when he saw her at the auditing firm months ago, he tried to find her weakness, too. He thought it would be her insecurity or her desire for a fairy tale wedding with a man like David. But the more he watched her, the more he realized her only weakness was that she didn't know how powerful she was. He said he had watched her stay late every night, fixing other people's mistakes without asking for a single thank you. Kendra looked at the fire, feeling the heat on her face. She asked him why he cared so much about a stranger. Kong-woo got up and walked over to her, his movements fluid and dangerous. He stood over her, looking down like a man who had finally found something he had been searching for his whole life. He told her that in his world, people were either sharks or bait. He said he had spent his life surrounded by sharks who wanted his throne and bait that wanted his money. But Kendra was something different. She was a woman who saw the truth even when it was buried under a mountain of lies. He said he didn't just want her mind, he respected it. He told her about the vow he had made when he took over the syndicate. He had promised himself that he would never let a woman into his world because love was a liability. He said he had spent years being this silent god, a man who didn't feel and didn't care. But watching her stand at that altar, ready to give her heart to a man who wasn't fit to touch her, had broken something inside him. He said he couldn't let a diamond be thrown into the trash by a fool like David. He reached out and touched her hair, his fingers lingering on the soft curls. For the first time, the touch wasn't about protection. It was about desire. Kendra felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She told him that she was tired of being a prize or a tool. She said she wanted to know who he really was behind the tattoos and the expensive suits. Kong-woo sat on the edge of the desk, his face softening just a fraction. He told her that he was a man who had seen too much blood and heard too many lies. He said he was lonely in a way that most people couldn't understand. He told her that having her in the house felt like the first breath of fresh air he had taken in decades. He promised her that there would be no more secrets between them. He said that if she stayed, she would see things that would make her want to run. He said his world was built on shadows, and the people he fought were monsters. But he also promised that as long as he was standing, no one would ever look down on her again. He told her she was the heart of the CO family now, even if the world didn't know it yet. Kendra looked at him and realized she wasn't afraid of the monsters anymore. She was only afraid of losing the man who finally saw her. As the fire died down to glowing embers, they sat in a new kind of silence, a silence that felt like a beginning. The house felt different the moment the heavy gates clicked shut behind Kong-woo's motorcade. He had to attend a meeting with the elders of the syndicate, a tradition that even the ghost of Soul couldn't ignore. Kendra stood by the window of the library, watching the tail lights fade into the night. She was wearing one of the silk robes he had given her, feeling the luxury of it against her skin, but the fabric couldn't stop the chill that was starting to crawl up her spine. For years, Kendra had spent her nights alone in her small apartment, eating cheap takeout and working on David's projects. She was used to being alone, but this was a different kind of solitude. This was the silence of a fortress. You have to wonder, right? Why would a man like Co Kong-woo, who has the world at his feet, go to such lengths for a forensic accountant he barely knew? Was it really about her mind, or was he just looking for the perfect weapon to take down his enemies from the inside? If you think he has a deeper reason for claiming Kendra, let me know in the comments. And if you're still here, you're part of this universe now. Hit like and subscribe, because the secret he's hiding is about to be revealed in the most violent way possible. The lights didn't just flicker, they died with a sharp, electric pop that left the room in total darkness. Kendra's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stayed perfectly still, her breath hitching in her throat. She told herself it was just a power outage, but the sky outside was clear and filled with stars. Then she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the muffled sound of suppressed gunfire followed by the crystalline crash of the glass doors in the grand foyer. Kendra's first instinct was to run, but her legs felt like lead. She remembered the man with the dragon tattoo telling her that she was a queen, but in this moment, she felt like the same invisible girl David had discarded. She felt like a problem to be solved, a loose end that needed to be cut. She heard heavy boots on the hardwood floors, moving with a terrifying rhythm. They weren't checking for jewelry or art. They were searching. "Where is the girl?" A voice rasped in the hallway. The words were in Korean, but Kendra had spent enough time around Kong-woo's documents to recognize the tone of a command. "The boss wants the accountant." She's the one who can link the accounts to the north. Find her and bring her head if she won't come quietly." Kendra didn't think. She reacted. She scrambled toward the massive mahogany desk in the center of the library. It was a heavy, old piece of furniture that smelled of polish and tobacco. She crawled underneath, pulling her knees to her chest and trying to make herself as small as possible. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that the darkness would hide her curves, praying that her weight wouldn't be the thing that gave her away. She heard the library door kick open with a force that made the walls tremble. A man entered. She could see his boots moving slowly toward the desk. The beam of a flashlight cut through the dark, dancing over the bookshelves and the velvet chairs. He was humming a low, tuneless song that made Kendra's skin crawl. He stopped right in front of the desk. She could hear his heavy breathing, the sound of a man who enjoyed the hunt. He sneered, a sound of pure mockery that echoed in the small space. "I know you're in here, little bird," he said, his voice dripping with a cruel kind of amusement. "A woman of your size can't hide for long. You take up too much space in this world." Kendra bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. The insult hurt more than the fear of the gun. It was the same thing David had said. It was the same thing the world had been telling her since she was a child. She was too big. She was too much. She was a target. She felt the man's hand reach under the desk, his fingers searching for her hair. She wanted the floor to open up. She closed her eyes and waited for the end, wondering if Kong Wu would even miss her, or if he would just find another accountant to balance his books. But then, the air in the room seemed to freeze. A silver blade whistled through the dark, embedding itself in the doorframe with a sharp, vibrating thud just an inch from the intruder's ear. The hunt was over, and the ghost had finally returned to claim his own. The intruder didn't even have time to scream. CEO Kong Wu didn't enter the room like a normal man. He appeared like a shadow that had finally decided to take a physical form. He was standing in the doorway, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The ink on his arms seemed to move in the dim light. He didn't use a gun. He moved with a speed that defied his size, closing the gap in 3 long, predatory strides. He grabbed the intruder by the throat and slammed him against the mahogany desk with a force that cracked the wood. Kendra watched from her hiding spot, her eyes wide with terror and awe. This wasn't the polished CEO who had wiped her tears at the church. This was the Mafia boss, the man who lived in a world of blood and shadow. The violence was brutal and efficient. Kong Wu used his hands with a cold precision, neutralizing the man in seconds. The intruder crumpled to the floor, a broken heap of leather and bad intentions. Kong Wu didn't even look at the man he had just destroyed. He didn't check for a pulse. His only focus was the space under the desk. He reached down and gently pulled Kendra to her feet. His hands were warm, but his face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't say a word as he checked her over, his eyes scanning for any sign of a wound. He looked at her face, her arms, and the way she was shaking. When he realized she was physically unharmed, the tension in his shoulders dropped just a fraction, but the fire in his eyes didn't go out. He pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands. Kendra didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not because she was trying to hide, but because his strength was so absolute that it made everything else feel insignificant. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw and low. "No." Kendra managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper. "Kong Wu, who were they?" "They were looking for me. They knew about the accounts." Kong Wu pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. He told her they were people who thought they could take what belonged to him. He told her that by bringing her into his house and claiming her at that church, he had put a mark on her that would never wash off. He asked her, with a strange kind of vulnerability in his voice, if she regretted coming with him. He asked if she would rather be back in her old life, where the dangers were small and the insults were quiet. Kendra looked at the man on the floor and then back at the man holding her. She thought about David's sneer and the way the guests at the wedding had looked at her like she was a joke. Then she looked at Kong Wu. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever owned. She realized that she would rather be hunted in the shadows with him than be invisible in the light with anyone else. She told him no. She told him she didn't regret it for a second. But she also told him that if she was going to be in this life, She needed to be more than just a girl hiding under a desk. She told him she needed to know everything. Kong-woo nodded slowly, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He told her that the slow burn was over. He said that from this night on, they would begin her training. He wouldn't just protect her, he would weaponize her mind. He said the people who sent those men had no idea what they had just started. He told her that David Reynolds had tried to break her, but Kong-woo was going to make her a legend. He led her out of the library, stepping over the body without a glance. As they walked through the dark hallway, the security teams finally began to move, but Kendra didn't look back. She knew the world was dangerous, but she wasn't running anymore. She was walking beside the king. The healing process was not just about the body. It was a total rebuilding of Kendra's soul. In the days following the brutal attack on the estate, the atmosphere between Kendra and Kong-woo shifted into something deeper. It was no longer a simple case of a victim and a protector. They became a unit. Kong-woo started spending every late night with her in the high-tech office. But he wasn't just monitoring the security feeds. He was actively teaching her the inner workings of his empire. He explained the complex connections between the international shipping lanes, the dock workers, and the digital bank accounts that kept his syndicate running. Kendra quickly realized that her brilliant mind was her most effective weapon, and Kong-woo was the only man who had ever truly known how to sharpen it. He didn't want her to stay hidden in the shadows of the mansion. He wanted her to be the one who controlled those shadows. The physical distance that usually existed between them began to vanish. Every time he leaned over her shoulder to look at a complicated ledger, Kendra felt the intense heat of his body. He would rest his large hands on the back of her leather chair, his thumbs occasionally grazing the silk of her custom robe. It was a slow, agonizing burn of attraction that made her heart race more than the sound of gunfire ever could. He never pushed her for more than she was ready to give. He never demanded her affection. Instead, he simply existed in her personal space, claiming her with every lingering look and every quiet word of sincere praise. He told her she was a titan, a woman built to lead an empire. When she looked in the mirrors now, she didn't see the broken girl who had been rejected at the altar. She saw a woman who was rapidly becoming the heart of a powerful syndicate. The emotional healing was the most surprising part of the experience. Kendra had spent her whole life feeling like she was taking up way too much room in society, but Kong-woo made her feel like the entire world wasn't big enough for her presence. He celebrated her curves, her sharp mind, and her incredible resilience. He treated her like she was something sacred. They shared long, comfortable silences that weren't awkward at all. They were full of an unspoken understanding. She knew that he would kill to keep her safe, and he knew that she would find the hidden truth for him. They were two outcasts who had finally found a permanent home in each other's long shadows. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the external danger. Kendra knew that the men who attacked the house were just the beginning of the war. Kong-woo started taking her to his private council meetings. He didn't introduce her as a mere assistant or a guest. He introduced her as the woman who had his complete and total trust. The look on the faces of his seasoned underbosses was a mix of pure shock and visible fear. They had never seen their legendary leader so focused on one person before. They saw the way he watched her every move, the way his jaw tightened if anyone dared to speak to her with even a hint of disrespect. The claim was public now, even if it wasn't yet official in the eyes of the law. Kendra felt the massive weight of her new position, and she carried it with a dignity that made her old life feel like a distant, bad dream. She was no longer running away from her problems. She was learning how to hunt the people who created them. Every night ended with a quiet moment together, a shared drink, and a look that promised a beautiful future. The fire in the hearth was nothing compared to the heat between them. It was a silent, powerful transformation that was turning a broken bride into a legendary queen of the underworld. While Kendra was finding her inner power, David Reynolds was slowly losing his mind. He had once been the golden boy of the corporate world, but after Kong-woo's dramatic intervention at the chapel, David's life had become a total disaster. His bank accounts were frozen, his reputation was in the garbage, and the girl he had cheated with had vanished the moment his money disappeared. He was broke, humiliated, and desperate for a way out. But David was the kind of selfish man who never took any responsibility for his own failures. In his twisted head, Kendra was the sole reason for everything bad that had happened. He hated her because she had found someone who actually saw her worth, and he hated her because she was finally free of his control. He didn't want to just survive. He wanted a brutal revenge. David knew he couldn't fight a man like Kong-woo directly. He was a coward who always preferred to strike from the dark. He went to the only people who hated the ghost of Seoul as much as he did. He sought out the desperate leaders of the Hangul Syndicate, the rivals who were currently losing millions of dollars because of Kendra's forensic audits. David offered them a trade. He gave them personal information about Kendra's life that Kong-woo didn't even have yet. He told them about her family, her daily routine, and her deepest, most private fears. He sold her out for a chance to get back his expensive lifestyle. He didn't care that he was putting her mother's life in imminent danger. He just wanted to see her crawl back to him on her knees, begging for mercy. He was a rat who had finally found a hole to hide in, and he was ready to bite the hand that had once fed him. The news of David's betrayal hit the estate like a physical blow to the chest. Kong-woo's extensive intelligence network quickly found out that David had fled to the rivals, and he wasn't going alone. He had brought them a list of Kendra's closest relatives, specifically targeting her elderly mother who lived alone. Kendra's heart felt like it was being crushed by a cold, heavy hand. She had thought her family was safe from this world, but David's obsession with hurting her was much deeper than she ever realized. He wasn't just trying to get his stolen money back. He was trying to destroy the only thing she had left to love. The power imbalance had shifted again. David was no longer just a joke or a memory. He was a weapon being used by men who knew how to kill without a single second of hesitation. Kong-woo didn't react with the frantic panic that Kendra felt. He sat behind his desk, his face looking like a piece of cold, carved obsidian. He told her that this was the heavy price of being a queen. He said that enemies will always go for the heart when they realize they can't reach the head of the organization. He promised her that her mother would be protected by his best men, but Kendra could clearly see the weight of the situation in the way his dark eyes narrowed. David had given the rivals the one thing they needed to make Kendra stop her audits: leverage. If they took her mother, they could force Kendra to delete all the digital evidence she had found. They could try to force her to betray the only man who had ever truly saved her from herself. Kendra felt the walls of the massive estate closing in on her. She had worked so hard to build a new life, to feel strong and capable, but David's return made her feel like that humiliated girl at the altar all over again. She felt exposed and vulnerable. She realized that David's knowledge of her past was a poison that could ruin her entire future. But she also saw the cold rage in Kong-woo's eyes, a fire that was growing larger with every passing second. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a protective fury that made the large room feel small. He told her that David Reynolds had just made his final mistake on this earth. He said that by involving her family, David had signed his own death warrant in blood. The rat had come back, but the dragon was ready to burn everything down to save her. Kendra's phone buzzed on the table, a harsh sound in the library. She didn't recognize the number, but her gut twisted with dread. When she pressed play on the video, her world stopped. There was her mother, tied to a chair in a dark room. Her mother's eyes were wide with terror. Behind her stood David Reynolds, looking smug and pathetic. He held a gun loosely while his other hand rested on her mother's shoulder. He looked into the camera and laughed, a sound that made Kendra's skin crawl. He told her he knew she was listening. He told her new life was about to end unless she gave him what he wanted. He demanded the decryption keys for the Hangul files. He said she had 1 hour to send the files, or her mother would pay for her wedding gift. He laughed again, and the screen went black. Kendra's breath hitched, and she felt the room spinning. She was ready to give him everything. She was ready to hit delete on her career if it meant her mother could go home safely. She began to type with shaking fingers, her mind a blur of panic. She didn't care about the syndicate or the money. She just wanted her mother to be safe. But before her finger could touch the send button, a warm hand clamped over hers. Kong-woo was standing beside her, massive and immovable. He didn't look at the phone. He looked at her with a focus that pulled her back from a cliff. He took the phone from her hand and, with one deliberate squeeze, he crushed the device until the glass shattered. He didn't blink as the electronics died in his palm. He threw the wreckage onto the floor without a word. Kendra let out a scream and began hitting his chest with her fists. She called him a monster. She told him that was her mother, the only person who had ever truly loved her. She begged him to let her save her mother. But Kong Wu didn't move. He caught her wrists and pulled her close, forcing her to look into his dark eyes. He told her they do not negotiate with insects. He said if she gave David the files, her mother would die anyway because cowards like David don't leave witnesses. He told her giving in wasn't how you save people. He said you save them by taking away the air until the enemy can't breathe anymore. He told her to look at him and see the Mafia boss she had married. He said they would do things his way because his way was the only way she survived. He told her he had already sent his elite units to secure the perimeter of every location David had visited. He said his technicians were already tracking the digital footprint of the video upload. He promised her that by sunset, David would realize that touching the CO family was a mistake you only make once. Kendra felt a cold calm settle over her soul. She stopped hitting him and let out a shaky breath. She realized she wasn't alone and that she had the most dangerous man in the city in her corner. She stood up and looked at the broken phone. She realized that crying was a waste of energy when there was work to do. She told Kong Wu she wanted to be the one to find the location. She told him her mind was the only thing that could bypass David's security. Kong Wu didn't say a word, but he reached out and touched her chin, lifting her head so their eyes met. He told her they were going to finish this together and that she was never going to be the invisible girl again. They walked out of the library, leaving the broken phone behind. Kendra felt a dark sense of purpose. David thought he was playing a game with a victim, but he was actually facing a queen backed by a dragon. The hour was ticking, but the ghost of Soul was already hunting, and the revenge was going to be final. She felt the weight of the black diamond on her finger, a symbol of power. They stepped into the hallway where the guards were already waiting for orders. Kong Wu led her toward the command center, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The command center was buried deep beneath the estate, filled with screens showing every corner of the city. Kendra sat in front of a console, her eyes focused on the raw data behind the video David had sent. Her mother was out there, and Kendra knew her mind was the only thing that could find her. Kong Wu stood behind her, his hand resting on the back of her neck. He didn't rush her. He simply waited, his presence a constant reminder that he believed in her brilliance. Kendra felt the familiar rhythm of the numbers, the way they shifted like a language only she could speak. She wasn't just an accountant today, she was a hunter. She ignored the fear and focused on the code, looking for the one mistake David had made while trying to be a villain. She found the discrepancy in the metadata quickly. David had tried to mask his location using a proxy server, but he was sloppy. He had used a public signal from a warehouse district that had been shut down for years. Kendra traced the signal back, bypassing the firewalls until she saw the truth. It was a cold storage facility on the south side, a place owned by a shell company David had helped set up when he was still an executive. Kendra felt a surge of adrenaline. She pointed at the screen, showing Kong Wu the exact coordinates. She told him her mother was there, in a room that didn't appear on any official blueprints. She felt a cold sense of triumph. David's past greed had just given her the key to his current hiding spot. Kong Wu leaned down, his face close to hers. He studied the map for a second before nodding to his head of security. The room exploded into activity as tactical teams began to mobilize. But Kong Wu stayed focused on Kendra. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. He told her mind was the most dangerous thing in his arsenal. He said while David thought she was just a girl he could bully, she was actually the one who had just signed his death warrant. He told her they were leaving now, and he wanted her in the command vehicle. He said he wanted her to see the result of her work. He wanted her to witness the moment her life truly changed forever. For a second, the tension in the room seemed to vanish. In the middle of the chaos, Kong Wu leaned in and kissed her forehead. It was a soft gesture that didn't fit the brutal world they were in. It was a promise. He told her he was going to bring her mother home, and then he was going to make sure Kendra never had to look over her shoulder again. Kendra felt a wave of relief and determination. She stood up, her shoulders back, her head held high. She was done being the victim. She was done being the girl who hid under desks or cried at altars. She looked at the man who had claimed her and realized he hadn't just saved her from David. He had saved her from her own doubt. As they walked toward the elevators, Kendra felt a sharp focus. She wasn't afraid of the warehouse or the men waiting inside. She knew David was expecting a broken woman. He had no idea she was coming for him with the full power of the CO syndicate behind her. She was the one who had found him. She was the one who had mapped out his downfall using the very tools he once mocked. Kongwu opened the car door for her, and as they sped through the dark streets, Kendra felt a dark sense of justice. David had tried to use her heart against her, but he forgot her mind was the one thing he could never control. The hunt was ending, and the queen was ready for her victory. The rain was hitting the roof of the armored command vehicle like 1,000 tiny needles. Kendra sat in the dark, her eyes glued to the bank of monitors showing the warehouse in high-definition thermal heat. She could see the glowing orange outlines of the men inside. She could see her mother, a smaller, trembling shape tied to a chair in the center of the room. David was there too, his outline pacing back and forth, a jagged shape of nervous energy. He looked small on the screen, a tiny man trying to play a big game he didn't understand. Kongwu sat beside her, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He wasn't looking at the screens. He was looking at her. He told her to watch closely because this was the moment she stopped being a victim and became the woman everyone feared. He signaled his team with a single word into his headset. The move was silent. On the screens, Kendra watched as the Ghost of Soul units moved through the shadows of the facility. They didn't kick in doors or shout. They slipped through the vents and the broken windows like a dark liquid. Kendra felt her breath hitch as she saw 3 tactical shapes close in on the room where David was holding her mother. She wanted to look away, to hide from the violence she knew was coming. But Kongwu's hand moved to her shoulder, grounding her. He told her to keep her eyes open. He said she needed to see the price of betrayal. David was shouting now, his voice crackling through the hidden microphones Kendra had helped plant via the digital hack. He was screaming about the money and the files, his voice high and thin. He had no idea the room was already full of his own ghosts. David thought he could auction off the woman he discarded like trash. He thought he could use her heart to break her mind. He's about to find out that when you steal from the Ghost of Soul, you don't just lose your money, you lose your right to exist. If you've been waiting for the moment David finally pays for every insult and every lie, hit that like button right now. Subscribe because the justice that's about to be served is something you'll never forget. Tell us in the comments. If you were Kendra, would you let Kongwu finish him, or would you want to pull the trigger yourself? The breach happened in a heartbeat. The thermal screens showed a flash of heat as the flashbangs went off, blinding everyone in the room. David stumbled back, his hands over his eyes, dropping his weapon. He tried to reach for Kendra's mother, trying to use her as a human shield even in his blinded state. It was a pathetic, cowardly move that made Kendra's blood run cold. But the tactical team was faster. A single, non-lethal shot from a suppressed rifle rang out. Kendra saw David's shoulder light up on the thermal feed as the bullet hit, spinning him around. He hit the ground hard, his arm useless, his power gone in a second. The men in black were on him before he could even let out a scream. Kongwu stood up, his presence filling the small space of the command vehicle. He told Kendra it was time. He opened the door, and the cold, wet air of the south side hit her face. It didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like freedom. They walked toward the warehouse, the heavy boots of the guards echoing on the wet pavement. Kendra didn't feel the fear that had defined her life for so long. She didn't feel like the obese girl who was a burden. She felt like a queen walking toward her throne. The guards bowed as Kongwu led her through the entrance, his hand never leaving the small of her back. The interior of the warehouse was cold and smelled of old oil, but Kendra only had eyes for the room at the end of the hall. When they walked through the door, the scene was one of total dominance. David was on his knees, his face pressed into the dirty concrete, his expensive suit ruined and soaked in his own blood. Her mother was being untied by a medic, her face a mask of shock and relief. Kendra ran to her, the silk of her own dress rustling against the grit of the warehouse floor. They held each other, and Kendra felt the last of her old life falling away. She looked over her mother's shoulder at the man on the floor. David was sobbing now, a wet, pathetic sound that filled the room. He was begging for his life, talking about how he was sorry and how he could make it up to them. He looked up and saw Kendra, and for the first time, there was no mockery in his eyes. There was only the absolute terror of a man who realized he had tried to play God alone. Kong-woo didn't look like a man who had just won a war. He looked like a man who was just starting one. He walked over to David Reynolds and looked down at him like he was a stain on a piece of fine silk. He didn't use his gun. He didn't even raise his voice. He knelt down, his expensive charcoal suit hovering just inches above the blood and dirt, and he whispered something into David's ear. Kendra couldn't hear the words, but she saw David's face go pale, his eyes wide with a horror that was deeper than physical pain. Kong-woo told him that death was too easy for a man like him. He told him that from this second on, David Reynolds was dead to the world anyway. He already used Kendra's findings to strip David of every single cent he had ever made. He had erased his social security number, his credit history, and his professional licenses. He told David that he would be allowed to live, but he would live as a ghost. He would be a man with no identity, sleeping on the streets of the city he once tried to rule, always knowing that Kendra was sitting in a palace he could never enter. Every time he felt the cold or the hunger, he would remember the woman he called embarrassing. He would remember that while he was starving, she was the heart of the most powerful empire in the world. He would be a living reminder of what happens when a small man tries to humiliate a queen. David was dragged out of the warehouse by two of Kong-woo's men. He didn't fight back. He looked like a man who had already been erased. Kendra watched him go, and she felt a strange sense of peace. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. There was only a clean, cold clarity. She turned back to her mother, who was looking at Kong-woo with a mix of fear and gratitude. Kendra took her mother's hands and told her she was safe now. She told her that they were going home to a place where no one could ever touch them again. She realized that the forensic accountant who lived in a small apartment was gone. She was someone else now, and she liked the person she had become. Kong-woo walked over to them, his face softening as he looked at Kendra. He didn't say anything about the violence or the money. He just asked if she was ready to leave the past in this warehouse. Kendra looked around at the cold, dark walls and the broken man who was being hauled away. She thought about the church and the laughter and the years of feeling like she didn't deserve a seat at the table. She looked at the man who had seen through her insecurities to the sharp mind beneath. She told him she was ready. She told him she was done with the shadows. As they walked out into the night, the rain had stopped, and the city lights were reflecting in the puddles like diamonds. Her mother was tucked safely into one of the SUVs, surrounded by guards who treated her with the same reverence they gave to Kong-woo. Kendra stood by the car door, looking up at the sky. She felt light, as if a massive weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She realized that she wasn't just safe because of Kong-woo's guns. She was safe because she had finally claimed her own power. She had used her mind to save her family and her future. She was the one who won. Kong-woo opened the door for her, his eyes warm and proud. They drove away from the south side, leaving the ruins of her old life behind. The past was closed, and the claim was about to happen. This final chapter brings the story to its emotional and cinematic conclusion, focusing on Kendra's ultimate transformation and the definitive claim by Seo Kong-woo. The moon was high over the estate when we finally returned. The air was crisp, and the silence was no longer heavy with secrets. It was a silence of victory. Kendra stood in the grand foyer, her mother already resting in the guest wing under the care of the best doctors money could buy. She looked down at her hands. They were still the same hands that had typed through the night to save an empire, but they felt different. They didn't feel like the hands of a woman who was meant to serve others. They felt like the hands of a woman who was meant to rule. Kong-woo was standing by the large glass doors that led to the gardens. He had changed into a fresh black shirt, the sleeves rolled up just enough to show the dragon ink on his skin. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a human being's entire life. He looked like a man who had finally found his peace. He walked toward her, the sound of his shoes on the marble floor the only noise in the room. He didn't say a single word until he was standing directly in front of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He told her that the ceremony at the chapel earlier that week had been a complete farce, a cheap play put on by a small man who didn't understand the value of what he had in his hands. He said that today wasn't about a wedding, it was about a coronation. He opened the box, and Kendra's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a traditional diamond. It was a massive, pear-shaped black diamond, surrounded by small rubies that looked like drops of blood under the chandelier light. It was dark, beautiful, and dangerous. He told her he wasn't asking her to be his wife out of pity or because she needed protection from the world. He told her he was asking because he couldn't envision his empire without her brilliant mind, and he couldn't accept his bed without her beautiful body. He took her hand, his skin warm and firm against her cold fingers. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her since the day she was born. He looked her in the eyes and said he claimed her, Kendra Lewis, in front of his men, his enemies, and the world. He told her she was the heart of the CO family now. He said that if anyone ever looked at her with anything less than reverence, they would answer to him. Kendra looked at the ring, then back at him. She realized she didn't feel like the obese girl or the abandoned bride anymore. She didn't feel like the girl who was too much for the world to handle. She felt like a queen who had finally found a king who was strong enough to stand beside her. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of salt, power, and a strange, dark kind of justice. They walked toward the gardens to check on her mother one last time before the night ended. The guards bowed as they passed, their heads low in respect for the woman who had saved their leader's fortune. Kendra looked back at the sprawling estate, the high walls, and the shadows that stretched across the lawn. The world was still a dangerous place, and there were still monsters hiding in the dark. But for the first time in her 30 years, the shadows didn't scare her. She wasn't running from the monsters anymore. She was married to the king of them. She knew that David Reynolds was out there somewhere, a ghost wandering the streets, but he was nothing but a memory now. Her future was here, in the arms of a man who saw her brilliance and her beauty in equal measure. She was Kendra Co now, and the world was finally going to learn her name. It was the definitive end of her old life and the true start of a grand empire. Subscribe now if Kendra's victory moved you. Tell us your location and current time. And also tell me which part was your favorite in this story.